Hello, this is Richard from animate.com with a short introduction to Deeptree, the asset library for trees and bushes. The idea behind the shading setup of Deeptree is that there are several approaches how to do low poly assets for particle systems of forests and other assets in nature. So for example, for trees, there are three different approaches how to make a forest. One would be to just use a plane where there is a bunch of tutorials online which suggests so, but as you can see in the shadow, this is a very, very bad approach because the shadow casting and the whole light shading will be very difficult to set up and to handle, and a lot of bad things happen here. So to get a volume which is shading more accurately, you would need a convex mesh which is mapped. But here you get the problem that the shading and the mapping won't resemble the spherical and the volumetric geometry of a tree or of plants. So what's done a lot is to make an intersection of different planes and map some textures onto them. But the downside is that you see a lot of intersections and flat shading and just very geometrical geometry coming up here. So Deeptree is mixing those two approaches in a very complex mathematical node setup. There's a lot of trigonometry and vector math going on in order to project these texture coordinates onto such a smooth shaded surface. So this surface looks as if it would be like that. At least the mapping coordinates are distorted so that something like this is resembled. And there we are. We see a smooth shaded convex mesh, but we got the detail of projected, highly detailed textures. And we have a very high performing shader for very few vertices. If we have a look here, so like in this case, it's 70 verts. So that's the principle behind it. You see that the shadow is casting as good as the one with the high detailed textures, while it won't show the harsh intersections of different planes, but rather a smooth shading of the convex hull approach. If we take a closer look, we of course see the different maps of those textures. There is one front view, one side view, and the top view texture mapped into the mesh. Additionally, you get a fourth texture which is mapped spherical around the center of the different texture planes, just to cover the harsh intersections, because there of course there would be a quite visible line or a border where the mapping changes. So you see some kind of spherical map placed inside this tree. And this of course looks horrific if you look at the node setup. Let's select it here. That's about the top level of our node setup. There are some crucial parts which you might want to change, like the textures themselves. Up here we have the spherical texture. It's an environment texture, because that's the easiest way to get the texture coordinates. So if we go inside these two shader groups here, these are the mapped front view and side view and top view textures, meaning I get in here. On the left side there is just the math which calculates the projection mapping, and inside here there is three different node groups which contain the textures. Here is the front view, the side view texture, and the top view texture. I use PNGs with an alpha channel. So if you want to change your textures, you do it inside here. And don't forget to also change the spherical mapped texture which is placed around. This one doesn't have an alpha channel because of the environment texture node. Instead, it uses the blackness, so black pixels will be transparent. And you can adjust the transparency here in this map range node, as well as the overall alpha transparency. The influence of blackness in your texture can be adjusted with this less than node. So if the brightness of the pixels in the texture is in this case below 0.005, the pixel will be transparent. That way you get those small holes inside your tree, which suggests that you look through the leaves. So what else? Down here we have the normal texture or the normal shading. I use a Voronoi texture. In several other shaders like the tropical trees, here I use a bump map in order to make the shading a little bit more advanced. But the rest is pretty straightforward. If you want to color overall your tree overall, then you could use this overlay color here. As you see, it really has a big influence on the color the tree will have. So let's have a look at an example. Here I have a river scene which consists of a plane mesh with some noisy wave texture and some stones with parallax mapping, as well as deep grass forest ground, meaning this is the library which is included in the full pack, or if you look on Blender Market /product/ deepgrass, you get this shader which maps in a similar technique some textures of bushes and twigs already onto the ground, while the ground itself has a completely flat geometry, but the textures look like growing up like particle assets already. So this is just a quite evenly distributed way to get a complex shading into your ground. And now we are ready to get our tree assets and distribute them on here. So I'm going to append, looking for my Deeptree conifers in this case. There are leaf trees and tropical trees and bushes as well. And if I append the file, I'm going to append the whole collection of conifers, because I'm using the collection inside the particle system. Our landscape will get a particle system, and we can fly through the settings which we have to adjust here. So maybe we want some, let's make it some 10,000 particles. We want them to be generated in the first frame only, so frame start and frame end is just one, and I want them to be seen in the whole timeline, so I adjust this to the length, the duration of the timeline, the lifetime. Yeah, and the source we have to adjust to not go with the density of the mesh, because my landscape is much denser at the area of the river and less dense in the hills. I want them not to be cheated, which would respect that and place them regarding the density, but just be randomly placed and distributed. So up on the hill where the mesh is not dense, there is as many trees as here in the foreground in the river area where there is a dense mesh. Now they're evenly distributed. We want some random order and even distribution, that's fine. And if we're unhappy with our distribution, we can change the seed, of course, to quickly influence the exact distribution itself. But I'm happy. Next, I'm going to turn off the physics, so they should not fall down. The particles shouldn't fall and shouldn't fly away with velocity. Once done, I can choose my particles and set their size. Here under the render tab, I choose render as collection, and we're choosing the conifers collection to see our conifers being spread over the landscape. We will adjust the size. Yeah, 0.7 looks good. Give it some randomness. Let's say 0.5, so that not all the tops are at the same level. And is there something we need to adjust here? No, there isn't. Render tab is done. Let's go over to rotation. We see that some conifers show in a strange direction. That's because they are aligned to the normal of the mesh. We want them to be aligned to the global Z coordinate. And still we can give it some randomness. Let's make that 0.1 and have a look. That's maybe too much. Let's make it 0.04. That's better. So in our case, the conifers have a local y-axis from bottom to top. In this way, we can set the randomized phase in order to get each particle a unique angle around the vertical axis. So much for that. Let's add some more trees. Let's make it 30,000. Yeah, that's better. And you see the performance is really well because it's so few vertices. It doesn't really have to place a lot of geometry for these assets. So you can use a lot of trees. And the last thing we adjust is they shouldn't be growing in the river. So I have to use a vertex group of my mesh. In this case, if we look at the vertex groups, let's go to edit mode. There is one which is the meadow, which is selected right now. You can see I will make the subdivision invisible here and here. So we see that everything which is not inside the water or near the water is selected now. That's the meadow vertex group. And in our particles tab, we can go to the vertex groups and choose the meadow in the density. So in object mode, we will see the distribution of our particles differs now, and it's not placed inside the geometry. There is some particles are placed in one another. Let's see if we can get rid of that. So it helped to check use modifier stack. This way we have about as many faces and vertices on our landscape for particle distributions as we have a number of particles. If the mesh has much less surface points, then some particles will end up at the same coordinate. So let's jump in the render view. Wait a few seconds until all the shaders are calculated, are compiled. Of course, the mapping, the projection mapping of our shaders will take some time because it's quite complex to calculate. But once done, we can adjust the rest of our scene. So that's looking pretty well. Maybe the trees a little bit small, especially compared to our ground textures. So let's, in a final step, let's just scale them up a little bit. Let's try 0.9. Didn't really change much. Yeah, so we can go with the smooth number 1 and scale randomness. That's a 1. Scale randomness 0.5, that's fine. And we would be ready to go and make some animation, camera animation. And next, let's place some bushes, at least here in the front, to not have this two-step shading. One is the shading of the landscape and one is the trees, but the shading, the shadow casting is very smooth between them. There could be much more detail and variation if we place some assets, bush assets, in between. For that, again, we go to File, Append, and choose the library for bushes, grass, and reed. And again, I'm going to import the collections. And that's bush, grass, and reed assets. So here's the conifers collection. Let's go back to shading view. My GPU is not the fastest. Here we have the collections. And of course, we will use a particle system again. In this case, because a lot of settings already were made, which are quite useful, I will just copy the settings of the first particle system. So I will generate a second particle system for the bushes, use the particle settings of the first one. Let's have a look. That's 001, quite confusing because the settings have the name of the system, of the other system. And in order to make new changes, to make new settings with this particle system for bushes, I'm going to make the settings unique. So I hit the number 2 here. And now I have settings for bushes. Okay, caps lock, sorry for that. So where do we want to place our bushes and how many? We need far less bushes. We don't need so many because we won't have bushes uphill and only in the foreground. Let's make some 5,000. And under the vertex groups, let's choose the shore for that. So again, our assets are now placed left and right of the river. But now we want to change the assets because we don't want the conifers a second time, but this time we want some bush assets to be distributed, and they should be much smaller. We see right away that they're not placed uphill or in the background, just left and right of the river, which is convenient. Let's scale them down to 0.2. Looks good. So we can adjust the count, the number of bushes we see, because they can be more than we see right now. Let's make 3 times more and add some reed in the end. For the reed, I will use a second particle system, and right like before, I'm using the settings for bushes and make it unique, so it's settings for reed, this time without caps lock. Okay. Of course, again, we can choose the vertex groups. These are not stored in the settings as we see. Again, we use the shore. So just left and right of our river. And under the render tab, we choose the deep reed assets. Since they have the same distribution as the bushes, we will have to change the seed of this particle settings. So I think we're done. Let's not show the outlines and go to rendered view. I hope you see the use of these assets and how economical or efficient they are. Maybe the reed is too big now. Maybe I will scale down the reed again because they're half the size of a tree. I think that's too much. So let's go down to the render tab and make it 0.1 for these. Yeah, that's a little bit better. I hit F12 and hope my computer won't explode. So I hope you see the use of these low poly tree assets and what you can do with it to enrich your scenes and landscapes. And maybe one last thing we can do is to make some variation in the color of each tree. For that, I will change to material view and let's select a tree and look up the shader nodes. Like mentioned before, there is this overlay node, and to get some variation, we can, for example, adjust the factor with a randomness per object. For that purpose, I'm using the object info and just plug the random slot into the factor of the mix node. And let's do that for the other trees as well. You know, each one has its own shader. So you see the trees have a little bit more variance in their color, and this might add to a more natural impression of our scene. Let's look at the rendering. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, just comment below or send me a message on Blender Market. I'm looking forward for your feedback. And as always, happy blending. Bye.